Welcome to the second in our series on understanding mental health. Tonight we've got what's going to be, I'm sure, a very interesting and informative conversation and presentation from, first of all, Dr. Rebecca Sharif, followed by Adjoa Aboah, who are going to be talking about surviving the new normal. This is about young people's mental health during the pandemic that we've all been going through. My name's John Geddes. I'm the head of Department of Psychiatry at Oxford University. The department is one of the leading departments in terms of trying to come up with new treatments for preventing and treating mental illness. And we've got a long track record of doing that. And during the time of the pandemic, we've been very busy identifying what's been happening and really trying to work out what's needed and put things in place. And we're doing a lot of research at the moment, trying to understand the impact of the pandemic, both for people who've had the illness, but also obviously for the rest of us who might still get it, and that causes anxiety. But also we've also been through lots of lockdown, uncertainty about what's happening to us, and separation from our normal social networks. So everything's changed. And it looks like we're going to have to put up with this for some time, hence the title of our talks tonight, which is Surviving the New Normal. Now, the format of the evening will be that Rebecca will talk, and then we'll have a conversation with Adjoa, and then we will have an opportunity for questions and answers. And if you could put your questions and answers, or your questions, you can put your answers in as well, sorry, but if you put your questions into the chat function, then we'll pick them up as we go along, and then we'll return and put that to the panel as we come to the end of the evening. So there will be an opportunity to do that. So I think that that's probably everything we need to talk about now. So I'm going to introduce you to Dr. Sharif. Rebecca has been in Oxford, I think she came to Oxford right at the beginning of the pandemic, actually. So it's been a very strange time for her, but then she's a particularly resilient and adaptable person because she's practiced in a huge number of countries across the world, including Colombia, New Zealand, Australia. And we're absolutely delighted that she's come to join us in Oxford. And she's been looking at the effect of the pandemic on young people. So I'm going to pass over to Rebecca now. Over to you, Rebecca.
Hello, I hope everyone can see me and hear me. As John says, I am a researcher from the Department of Psychiatry. I am also a consultant psychiatrist working clinically, currently out in Witney. And I have a passion for youth mental health that's taken me, as John says, all over the world for the last 20 years, only to land me back in Oxford in, of all times, March 2020. So I'm going to be talking about mental health in young people. When I talk about young people, I'm mainly going to be talking about people around 16 to 24 or 15 to 25. I'm mainly going to be talking about the common mental disorders, anxiety and depression. I'm going to be talking about the impact of COVID also. I'm going to be talking about the potential benefits of cultural resources, in particular museums and online museums, given the situation with COVID. And I'm going to tell you about some surprising results from our ongoing current research. So to start off with, I'm just going to give you a bit of a background, because researchers found that around 3/4 of adults with a diagnosed mental health problem first experienced symptoms before the age of 24. The problem is that many people don't seek help until they've had symptoms, sometimes for a number of years. And this is a particular problem for young people. So we know that their help-seeking behaviour, their chances of going to the GP are lower than other people. And so I think this kind of made us realise that there was a problem. There are services there, but young people aren't necessarily accessing them. And I think I was the first person to actually ask them. Well, I imagine other people asked them, but I was the first person to do it as a research project. So in 2003, in Melbourne, Australia, I spoke to 15 to 18-year-old help seekers and actually interviewed them and found out what it felt like to become depressed and why they weren't getting help. And what they said was, I interviewed 29 of them. I recruited 30, but one dropped out. And they said that they realized something was wrong. They all realized something was wrong before they reached threshold, you know, full diagnostic criteria for major depressive disorder. But what they found was that they didn't know what it was. They felt alone. And sometimes they didn't even have the words to say what was going on for them. And so they knew it was a thing, but they didn't know what that thing was. And what they also said, that we recruited boys and girls, and the girls said that it affected the way they related to others, and the boys said it affected the way that they related to the world. And so is this a problem? Is it a problem that young people have mental health problems? Is it mild and self-limiting like the common cold? Or is it something we need to worry about? Well, there's evidence that having a mental health problem as an adolescent or young adult can be associated with problems into adult life. So not only is it distressing and potentially risky at the time, in terms of risk-taking behaviours and potential suicidality, it also has implications for the rest of your life on things like educational attainment, suicidality, physical health problems, employment, and further mental health problems. And this is true even for what we call sub-threshold symptoms, even people who haven't necessarily reached threshold for depression. So essentially what we're saying is that at this sort of pivotal time in life, when you're deciding what to do in terms of your role and your education and your relationships and leaving the family home, that actually can have an effect on your decision-making that might affect you later or throughout your life and have an impact on your life trajectory. And so what's coronavirus done? Well, as expected, the social distancing that John was talking about, the economic and personal uncertainty does seem to have had an impact on common mental disorders. So the Office for National Statistics, in their study, it was found that probably anxiety and depression in adults has doubled, and about a third of people aged 16 to 39 had moderate to severe depression. So we are seeing what looks like an increase in the incidence of depression. And my previous research also showed that it's not so much what you've been through, but how you've reacted to what you've been through that's a predictor for how you get on in the future, or how you cope with further adverse events. So with lockdown, it was noticed that people flooded to online museums. And we at the University of Oxford, Department of Psychiatry with John, and the Ashmolean were successful at getting some COVID-19 Oxford University funding. And what we really wanted to do was find out what research had been done in the area of museums already, what was happening in the real world, who was using the online cultural resource, and how were they finding it useful. We also wanted to find out if there were any particular vulnerable people who would benefit more than others. And we wanted to see if we could ask them how it was helpful and test. So develop an intervention based on what they were saying and then test that resource to see if it genuinely was helpful for anxiety and depression against a control, or at least collect some pilot data. So what we found was that we searched globally, or in all languages, for previous research, to see if there were any research studies that looked at anxiety and depression and compared people who used museums to other people. And we found a potential across languages and across countries, 13,000 studies, and we've gone through them by hand, and we've still got 200 more to look at, but we haven't found any that have really looked at museums in that way. And so we did a survey with the Ashmolean and looked at the people who were using the Ashmolean online. And what we found wasn't a huge surprise, that there was more females, white people, high income respondents. But we did find that young people also answered the survey, not as many, but the young people who answered had higher proportions, or higher proportions of them had clinically significant anxiety and depression, and that people seem to benefit in different ways. So we thought, actually, young people do seem to be vulnerable, and there's an argument for targeting them because they potentially benefit in different ways. And this is where the surprise came. So the young people were more diverse. They were less likely to be habitual users of online culture, and they were more diverse in terms of their income and ethnicity. And they were a mix of males and females. And we interviewed those who left their email addresses, we interviewed them. So we've interviewed 13 of them. And this is where the surprise came, because a lot of them answered our questions, how's online culture useful, or what in your usual life is helpful that could be applied to online culture. And they said things like exercise is quite helpful and shared experiences are quite helpful. But all of them, and this was the most prominent theme, found that stories were helpful. Stories in which, about real people that they could identify with and reflect, that could be reflected in, that took them across time and space. And they found that that helped with empathy, perspective, to rise above the inner conflict, provide human connection. Even some of them said it could help with proactivity and reduce subconscious bias. And so they wanted to hear stories about people who didn't fit in. They wanted to hear stories about transition. They wanted to hear stories about people who had inner conflict. They were fascinated by Paul Jacobsthal, who fled Nazi Germany with a Tang Dynasty camel. They were fascinated by Lizzie Siddle, who was a pre-Raphaelite model, an artist who portrayed herself differently to the artists who painted her. And they wanted to also hear different perspectives. They wanted to hear, they thought they would get comfort from hearing different points of view. And they thought that this would have an impact on their current negative thinking. We asked them, do you just want to hear happy stories and stories of resilience? But no, they wanted to hear real human stories. And they wanted to hear about people who had had similar struggles to themselves. Now, I'm going to stop sort of giving you what I'm saying. And can I just give a quick quote, John, from what one of the participants said? I think he's going to say yes. Okay. So one of them said, it helps relate it to yourself in some way, to either empathize with the people at the time or give you some kind of perspective in your life. For example, looking at cultural things like the plague and thinking other people who have experienced a similar kind of pandemic, and thinking we will be okay, it's not the end, knowing it's happened before. So in conclusion, of course, we need to make our resource and test it. But I think more importantly, also in young people, thinking about how we can mitigate against some of the poor outcomes that come from having a mental health problem early in life. Thinking about community resources, what works in who and how, and reconfiguring services so that they more accurately help the people that they're meant to be helping. And it's absolutely lovely also to meet Adjoa, who has created a forum and a safe space for young people to talk.
Thanks very much indeed, Rebecca. And what I want to do now is introduce Adjoa Aboah, who's probably needs no introduction. She's an activist, world-renowned model and actress. She's the founder of Girls Talk, which is a community-led organization dedicated to promoting the mental health and well-being of adolescent girls and young women. following Adjua's personal experience with mental health, Girls Talk was formed really with the goal of creating safe spaces on and offline where young women can share openly, listen and support each other without judgment or shame. So Adjua, welcome to the conversation. Maybe you and Rebecca can reflect on some of the things you've been talking about, Rebecca. And I'll come back in a few minutes to ask to pose some questions.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you, John. Hi, everyone. Let me just change this gallery view because this is annoying. Oh, hi, Rebecca.
Hi, Adjua.
Yeah. Oh, that was a brilliant, brilliant talk. Thank you so much. So I've been thinking where we begin, to be quite honest, and we've spoken briefly about the kind of subjects we want to highlight during this talk. And I thought maybe best to start on this idea of loneliness and being alone and the link that has in terms of storytelling and referencing yourself from someone else's story, which is really the backbone of everything that we do at Girls Talk. So maybe we start there and then we can flow into all the other different subjects that we want to talk about today.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting because I think a lot of therapies and a lot of what we do in mental health is talking about your own feelings, your own thinking, your own behaviours. And actually what we've found from the young people we've talked to, and I think what you've found is that actually people are interested in looking at themselves, but they're also really interested in hearing other people's stories. And in that way, you know, maybe it's a safer space, a way that people can connect with each other through those stories. So I think that it's really interesting that that's what the young people are saying. You know, don't make us think about all that's going on inside because that's really hard. But in doing that, they're able to reflect and empathize and really think about how those other stories affect them, how they're similar, how they might be having similar things. And they really wanted to see other perspectives and a way to shift how they were thinking.
Yeah, because I think what I found so interesting about our previous conversation and something, you know, it was one of the first reasons why I started Girls Talk, to be quite honest, was this. And, you know, I was continuously told that it might be triggering to talk about things. I wasn't educated in these subjects. Was I able to actually talk about these things? And it was something you said about taking young people seriously and asking them what they want, because it's so hard when you're younger, when you don't have the ability to articulate what's going on in your head and you haven't been given the language or the safe space or the education to really know what's going on. And I definitely know before I was diagnosed, before I was like 22, I was, you know, I knew that I was I was hormonal. I knew I was about to, you know, I just got on my period. I knew that I hadn't lost my virginity. These were all things that, you know, part of adolescent life that I had to go through. But they started off as very like small things. And I think because those things weren't taken seriously, to be quite honest, they then kind of manifested themselves into bigger problems. But I love what you do in terms of really asking young people what they want and what they want to talk about and what they need, I suppose.
I think you're right, Adjua, and I think we've almost become anxious and avoidant as a society. And there's almost this sort of fright that if we start talking about it, is there going to be this unstoppable tsunami of problems and what on earth are we going to do? And I think the thing to remember is those problems are there. Those probably, you know, it's not like we're talking about them is going to make them appear. But the thing is, if we talk about them and if we know about them, then we can think about how to manage and how to think about how to manage those problems, whether it's using community resources or, you know, finding evidence in different spheres and really collaborating with young people and different ways of helping that aren't necessarily sitting within GP offices or secondary psychiatric care. But I think you're absolutely right. We've sort of become a bit avoidant of actually letting people talk about what's going on.
Completely. And I think, you know, back to storytelling and everything you said, it's also about bridging that gap between both storytelling and educational resources and academia. And I think far too often you either get one or you get the other. And I definitely know, I hate that using this word, but something that was very like insightful and empowering was understanding the workings of my brain and really getting to grips with how it worked, and understanding anxiety in all its layers, and understanding you know, everything behind medication and what medication I was taking, and really figuring out what the, you know, without a doctor telling me, looking at the side effects of myself, really checking in with my body. But I think, you know, it's definitely something that we've spoken a lot about at Girls Talk, is bridging that gap, having people tell their stories, stories of hope, stories that make you feel resilient and persevere, but also backing that up with everything that you do, you know, backing it up with research and facts, so that you, and I think that goes back into, you know, stigma reduction and prevention, because I think far too often society has little understanding of the workings of mental health. You know, we're given this kind of one-dimensional look on what anxiety is, or what bipolar is, or what suicidality is. And I think it's so important to hear from others and to hear from all different types of people what it actually feels like, and then have someone like yourself also back it up with the research.
And that's the fascinating thing. I think there's so many preconceived ideas and assumptions. And, you know, even sort of trying to make a resource that's reflecting and trying to take what these young people are saying that they want, and people saying, oh, no, we mustn't tell them, you know, sad stories. And actually the people are saying, no, please, we want to see how other people have dealt with it and coped with it and what's happened to them. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a really happy ending. We just want to have that empathy, that knowledge that it's happened to other people before. And I think the other fascinating thing really is thinking of the power of the story. And exactly as you say, you know, it's really important to know what happens to individuals, but it's absolutely essential to also back that up with numbers and research and control groups, because it's lovely to think that online culture might be helpful. And it's nice to say, oh, people got better after we used it. But unless we have a control group, unless we randomize, we haven't got the science behind saying, actually, where should we put our resources? So I think both things are absolutely essential.
And moving on from that and talking about the work that you do with adolescents, it was something you said when we last spoke about the value of early intervention. And I think that links very naturally back into how, you know, I'm not sure I can really say for a certain, but I know that if my school had the necessary means to give me more than just a counselor, and really just had given me some sort of space or knowledge into what was going on, I don't know, maybe it wouldn't have had to get to such rock bottoms. But I know you speak a lot about the value of early intervention, and that works quite well. And I think it would be great for everyone to know about the fact that at the age of 18, the way in which mental health is treated changes, and the way that the access to mental health changes, and the legal situation changes, and the fact that, you know, I think our brains are so different, and I don't know, I just think I think far too often we think that we can start, we're waiting for someone to mature. We're waiting to talk to them about these serious things when they're older. But I think it would be great if you could tell our lovely audience about, you know, the importance and the value of early intervention.
And I'll answer this question as a person and as a clinician, because it's affected sort of me personally and my family, and that's why I got into this. And really, from my point of view, it seems just ridiculous that we wait till somebody gets really unwell and has potentially, you know, feeling suicidal and has maybe dropped out of school or college and has lost their friends, before we really say it's severe to do anything. And there's arguments about, well, can we prevent it, or are we just delaying it? And I would argue that either way, actually it's a worthy cause, because I think that actually late in adolescence and early adulthood, just as you're finding your feet in life, is a really difficult time to have a serious mental health problem. If we were able to delay it until somebody's more established in their adult life, more able to cope, has a stronger support network, then actually even delaying it would be, I believe, potentially a worthy cause. But we need definitely more research to kind of figure out who's most at risk, who we should intervene with, what we call, factors with the sort of prognostic weight. How do we know, who to help and in what way? And so that's essential. But you're totally right. I sat in my team meeting today with 18, 19, 20-year-olds being referred and basically being kind of triaged on a level playing field with much older adults. And it just doesn't make sense. We definitely need to think of a better way to serve people between about 18 and 25, so that they don't get cut off at the age of 18 and have to use adult services.
And I've noticed a lot at the moment that there's been a lot of adolescent units are being closed down. I know the one at the treatment center where I was at was closed, and there's been a few people I know who've been, whose parents have been looking for like treatment centers for them, are finding it more and more hard to find a place that can treat anyone under the age of 18. Why do you think that is? I don't know.
I think it's often a resource. I don't know these individual cases. I think it's often a resourcing issue. Certainly the services I was working in Australia in the early 2000s, they were early intervention for psychosis, but they were moving to, providing early intervention for mood disorders and anxiety disorders for that age range. And from a clinical perspective, it makes sense. From a research perspective, it makes sense, because if we think that this is when first episodes will be occurring, that's an ideal time to get in with that early intervention prevention strategies and look at the long term to see if they really prevent those longer term outcomes. So I agree, it's essential.
So
you're coming back on, John, but I've got one more thing I want to talk about.
I always like this when I come back on. I get pressed back immediately. So go ahead, Adjoa, please.
One more thing, because Rebecca, I think it's really important that we talk about community, and especially, against the backdrop of everything that's happening at the moment, whether it be COVID, the resurgence of Black Lives Matter. I think we both say this quite often about finding your tribe. And it was only the other day that I was watching the news and I heard it was this question and answer thing, and someone wrote in and was like, why wouldn't students be happy to do university at home? And I just thought it was the most ridiculous question, because of this idea of community, and that not all of us come from cosmopolitan cities, not all of us come from happy households, and that university might be the first time where you are able to find like-minded people who share the same values as you, going back to what we said, who share, who you can, people who you can meet who have different perspectives and can give you a different outlook on life. And I think I want to just talk briefly about community and finding a community that's reflective of yourself and how important that is to one's mental health.
Yeah, and I think it's very poorly researched. And again, from personal experience, for sure, I played rugby for university, and I think that was much more helpful to my mental health than sort of a counsellor would have been. I met people, I was reflected in people who presented in different ways, people I wouldn't usually have met, people who had different bodies, people who identified in different ways, and the positive effect that sort of community can have is massive. And you talk to the social prescribing people and they will say it has a huge impact on mental and physical health. Finding your tribe, finding something outdoors to do, potentially finding people who reflect you. And the real challenge at this point is working out what works for who and how can we make sure these community resources optimize mental health for the people who come.
Thanks very much. I mean, there's some really great questions and comments coming up in the chat section. I mean, some of the things you've actually already covered. So I think Alessandra Marks asked about how much do you think that these issues stem from a lack of belonging? So or not having tribe. And Adjoa, you mentioned this a bit, but also, I mean, there's a difference, isn't there, between causation and then maybe that actually helping as well or preventing. So Rebecca, is there any research on that? Any comment, Adjoa, on that?
I mean, I wouldn't be able to talk from the kind of research point of view, but in terms of the personal, I think not belonging plays a massive part in one's mental health. And I think as someone who still battles with their mental health, that is one of the main triggers, is feeling that I don't belong, feeling uneasy in myself and not knowing where I fit in. And I think that's why my mental health is something that I still continuously work on. But if I think about all those years ago, before I knew and before I was on medication and before I'd really had the ability to ask for help, I was completely, what would be the right word? I was completely exhausted by the idea that I didn't know where I fit in. And I was paralyzed in that fear of I didn't know how to search for my own tribe. And I was, I'd gone to a school that, I don't know, I didn't feel like those were the people that I wanted. I didn't feel like I fit in. And so it wasn't until after, and really Girls Talk, to be quite honest, where I think that's probably one of my favorite parts of Girls Talk, is especially our live events. You walk in and it's completely intersectional, and you'll find girls from, or anyone who identifies as a girl, from all walks of life. And I think it's, for some people, where depending on where they've come from, it will be the first time where they feel like they belong. And I think that was something that I was always searching for when I was younger.
And I think totally right. The sort of bi-directional relationship, feeling lonely can contribute to anxiety and depression. Being depressed or anxious can make you feel more lonely. And certainly the stories that are resonating from the young people we're talking to, that they're talking about, looking at people who don't fit in and really saying, it's nice to know other people have felt that. So yeah, I totally echo that.
And there's a lot of good, raising of lots of online and community resources, including Girls Talk, Adjoa, lots of people saying how helpful they find that. But there's one question that says, I mean, we're identifying, as well as the sort of services, that there's lots of community services and activity, Rebecca, and obviously your work covers that. What's the evidence base like at the moment for those alternatives you like to care in prevention and maintaining mental health? I mean, that's one of the key questions I think that's coming out of this, isn't it?
It is a key question, and certainly the systematic review we're currently sort of in the middle of, which we've been really inclusive, all languages, all countries. We had a fantastic information specialist who sort of searched databases all over the world. And really our only criteria have been human experiments in the community, looking at anxiety and depression. We've looked at all sort of age groups above 15. And there's really not much, certainly not much in museums. There seems to be maybe a little bit more in art and music, so we'll be able to extract those. But the evidence base, it's more sort of aspirational. It's more, we think this is probably useful, but in the same way as you would have with psychological or medication, there's not the rigorous studies that will really tell us if they work, in who and how.
And that's, I think Upper Manu goes sort of raised the point that she's noticed that at times learning about others' problems can increase anxiety, because one, in a sense of having limited capacity yourself, or worrying that one's own situation might not meet a similar positive end.
So I think that's a really good point, because something that I think it was, to echo that, it was definitely something that I struggled with, and was played quite a detrimental role in why I didn't ask for help, because I come from a privileged background. you know, my parents have they gave me a great education. We went on beautiful holidays. So with that as a backdrop, I always felt that my qualms, my sadnesses weren't valid. And in turn, it meant that I didn't speak about them. And I had anxiety about really kind of getting them out in the open, because I thought, you know, why burden people with what I'm going through when there are so many people out there who are going through maybe a lot harder things than I might have been going through. But the hopeful part is that when I went to treatment, I was surrounded by people who had come from different backgrounds and who had grown up very differently to myself. And I have the same thing as Girls Talk. There's many times where I talk to, whether it be single mothers or refugees, or, you know, it ranges all the time. And I have no understanding of what they've been through, but I have an emotional maturity to meet them in the middle, and I can empathize, and I can pull from my own emotional background what that might feel like, and I meet them in the middle without any stigma or judgment. And I think that's something that I was shown during treatment, that it didn't matter where we all came from, didn't matter what drugs they did, how, you know, all, you know, whatever it was, whatever the backstory was, we met at that time because of what our shared knowing that we were all having a difficult time at that point.
Thanks very much, Adja. And I think on that note, we probably better bring it to an end, actually, because although we probably could go on all night. So thanks to both of you and to the audience for really fascinating questions, and apologies for not being able to get around everything. There's just a few people I want to thank, as well as Adja and Rebecca, and that's Dora Lowenstein and Saffron Wade, who sort of made this whole thing happen, and Tom Stutterford for all his help in presentation, and of course Sally Rennie and Andre from the Mental Elf, who's kind of coordinated the whole thing for us this evening. And we will be sort of, you know, putting together a recorded version of this, which will be available on YouTube. So do keep an eye open for that. Sally's put where it will be available from next Tuesday. So that's Tuesday next week. In the meantime, I'm going to say goodbye on behalf of our panel and everyone else here. And thanks again for the fantastic chat. We'll try and capture all that as well. I think it's pretty clear what we need to do. Lots more of all the things we've been talking about tonight. So I wish you a great evening, and goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.